In today's episode of Health Theory with Dr. Steven Gundry, we talk about why eating too much meat may actually shorten your life, how these things called lectins that you're probably stuffing your face with cause leaky gut, the single healthiest food on the planet, and the seemingly healthy foods that are actually probably killing you. Today's guest is Dr. Steven Gundry. He's a heart surgeon, medical researcher, former president of the American Heart Association, and New York Times best-selling author of the deeply fascinating book, Plant Paradox. He's performed 10,000 surgeries and holds the record for longest survival of a pig to baboon heart transplant. And what I want to know is, how do you, somebody who eats a primarily plant-based diet, how did you come to the conclusion that there are some plants that are okay and some that are actually outright bad for us?
Well, it actually all started with a major at Yale University as an undergrad back in the dark ages, where we could actually design our own major. And we could actually develop a theory that we wanted to defend. And my theory was that you could take a great ape, manipulate its food supply and its environment, and prove you would arrive at a human being.
Over generations?
Over a long period of time.
Okay.
And so I actually defended my thesis and got an honors, and gave my thesis to my parents and went off to become a very famous heart surgeon and cardiologist. And one of the things I discovered way back then was that we evolve in concert with the plants that we're eating, or the animals that we're eating, but back then we were eating leaves. And there's actually now evidence that the thing that makes us human as opposed to a chimpanzee is there's a distinct change in the gut microbiome between when chimps and gorillas evolved off and we evolved out. And you can actually tell a human being by their distinctive gut microbiome instead of a chimpanzee, for instance. We share 98% of all of our genetic material with chimps and gorillas, and yet we're profoundly different. And what makes us profoundly different from them is not our genes, it's actually the genes of our microbiome.
Unfortunately, my wife has had some very real experience with just how important the microbiome is. You're the only person I've ever heard talk about that. I'd love to hear more about that. So if we were going to prove your thesis out, what would we be doing to the diet to create that effect in the microbiome that would express such a radically different species?
Lectins are plant proteins that are one of the major defense systems of a plant against being eaten. One of the things that's hard for us to conceptualize is that plants do not want to be eaten. They actually have a life, and they were actually here first. When insects arrived, plants had a problem because they couldn't run, they couldn't fight, they couldn't hide, but they have a huge advantage, and that's they're chemists. They can turn sunlight into matter, and we haven't figured out how to do that yet. So what they do is they make proteins that are sometimes called sticky proteins, or lectins, that stick to certain sugar molecules in us, particularly in our gut lining. Just by the way, if anybody has sinusitis or runny noses when they eat certain foods, you are actually producing sugar molecules in your mucus to trap lectins. And I have so many people who had chronic sinusitis, including myself. When we finally got lectins out of our diet, they completely went away. So lectins bind to sugar molecules. Lectins cause the wall of our gut to actually separate, and people have heard the term leaky gut. I used to, if you'd asked me 15 years ago if I thought leaky gut was a problem, I would have said it was pseudoscience. Now, with the advances in understanding how the microbiome works and in understanding how lectins work, I think everyone who has a disease has a leaky gut. Now, I'm pretty dumb. Hippocrates said this 2,500 years ago, that all disease begins in the gut. So one of the things we know about research is research. Look again, because somebody already knew this, and Hippocrates knew it 2,500 years ago.
It's really interesting, and I have heard that quote so many times, and it's one that I just accept and go, oh wow, what a great insight. What do you think led him to that? Even now, people have a hard time conceptualizing the microbiome because it's invisible. So how did he come to that conclusion?
He had this interesting theory. He believed that any creature has what he called, the translation is green life force energy, that actually wants perfect health for that creature, and that it's a driving force. Unfortunately, he believed, as I do, that there were external forces that were preventing that expression of green life force energy. So he thought the purpose of a physician was to identify those external forces that were keeping the green life force energy from expressing itself and remove them, or teach the patient to remove them. And then the patient would heal him or herself because the green life force energy would take over. Now that sounds kind of new age and touchy-feely, but he was absolutely right. And one of the things that I guess I and other people have discovered is that one of those external contributing factors are lectins. And if you remove certain lectins, you'll start to heal yourself. Let me give you another example. If we're out on the ocean in a boat, and the boat springs a leak in the bottom of the boat and water is rushing in, we have two options. The one option is we grab a bucket and we start bailing. The bigger the hole is, like the old commercial, we're going to need a bigger bucket. And I think that most systems for healing the gut are just giving people buckets to bail whatever. It's a lot easier to plug the dumb hole, and then you don't need buckets. And so if lectins are one of the major ways that we get leaky gut, then if we get lectins out of our diet, that's how we plug the holes. Unfortunately for us, the lining of the gut is only 1 cell thick. And so imagine 1 cell thickness keeping everything you eat or everything living in you, like bacteria, separated from you. And they're all held together, locked arm in arm with tight junctions. So what Dr. Fasano showed with gluten, which is a lectin, is that gluten makes its trouble by causing leaky gut. So once those spaces are open, not only do lectins get through, which are foreign proteins, they're splinters, but also pieces of bacteria, or living bacteria, also get through the wall. Now, on the other side of the wall is your border patrol, your immune system. And 65% of all the white cells in our body are up against this wall. Why are they there? Because that's where the problem is going to happen, if it's going to happen. So when these foreign proteins get across the wall, the immune system basically sounds the alarm, sounds the air raid sirens. We go to threat level 5, we scramble the fighter jets, and we actually go to war status. And as I talk about in the book, that war status is manifested in multiple ways, whether it's brain fog, whether it's arthritis, whether it's depression or anxiety, whether it's coronary artery disease, which is how I got interested in it in the first place. And all of these things come right back to what Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago, that if you want to cure the disease, head to the gut. And I see this, for instance, I had so many allergies as a young adult and in college that I had to get all allergy shots. And, you're allergic to things. Well, my allergies were just because my immune system was just on hyper overload. I don't have any allergies anymore. I didn't outgrow my allergies. Through the last 17 years, I've told my immune system to chill out. There's nothing to be interested in here because there's nothing coming across the border.
That's super interesting. Probably about 3 months ago, I started getting really itchy. And then just my chest would itch like crazy, my back would itch like crazy. I'm like, what is going on? Because I'm really religious on my diet. I don't cheat on my diet, but a couple times a year, I'm really hardcore about it. And then it started with a little spot on my neck. And then it was I had to wear long sleeve everything. I was just one big rash. It was it was insane, and I've never had anything like that in my life. And so I was like, I know this is something I'm eating, just like in my gut, I can feel that that's true, but I haven't changed my diet. So I was like, what could this be? And before I give you the punchline of what I think it is, when you hear stuff like that, where do you go?
Well, the best way to think about your skin is the lining of your gut is actually your skin turned inside out.
That's fascinating.
And so you have from your mouth all the way down to your anus a tube that's got the surface area of a tennis court. And everything that you swallow is actually outside of you as it's moving through. The inside skin has to do the same functions as the outside skin, and that is kind of keep things away from us, but it's got a fatal flaw. It not only has to keep things out, but it has to let things in, like the proteins and the fats and the sugars that we eat. So that's where the mischief can happen. But when I see someone with an external skin problem, it's always a reflection of what's actually happening in the gut.
What is that process? What does it look like? How can people that are watching this now, if they're struggling from something, how do they begin that process of repair?
So, I think the first thing you do is get major lectin-containing foods out of your diet. You won't like me for a couple of weeks, but most people, even within a couple of weeks, begin to notice a difference. Now, what are those? They're foods that we actually, evolutionary, were not designed to eat. Beans are so lethal raw that there's very good published studies in humans that they can cause massive bloody diarrhea. And there's some pretty good studies in monkeys, rhesus monkeys and red velvet monkeys, that they can actually cause heart disease and even kidney damage from the lectin content. What's fascinating from a human evolution standpoint is that humans, up until the dawn of agriculture, were actually very tall creatures. Most humans were about 6 feet tall, and our brain size was about 15% bigger than it is today. And if you look chronologically, by 8,000 years, 2,000 years into grain and bean eating, we actually shrunk about a foot, and our brain size has never recovered from 10,000 years ago. So these are anti-nutrients. Grains and beans, that's number one. Number two, 2,000 years ago, northern European cows suffered a genetic mutation, a spontaneous mutation where they stopped making the normal protein in milk, casein A2, and began making casein A1. Now, casein A1 has a lectin-like protein that is converted into a compound called beta-caseomorphine, which can cause a direct immunologic attack on the beta cell of the pancreas, the insulin-producing cell in the pancreas. And there's some pretty good evidence, and it's accumulating every year, that one of the causes of type 1 diabetes or juvenile diabetes is casein A1 milk. And it actually correlates very well in countries that have casein A1 cows. They have much higher incidence of type 1 diabetes than countries that have casein A2 cows. Cheeses, for instance, are safe from France, Italy, and Switzerland. Sheep, goats, and water buffalo are all casein A2.
And what is it about that that's so problematic?
It actually it's a lectin-like compound that stimulates an immune response.
So just as I would get from the beans or whatever, I'm
exactly. You'll get the same thing.
Okay.
So it's a very new addition to our diet. Now, the newest addition to our diet is some of our most precious foods are North American or South American foods. For instance, in the nightshade family, potatoes, eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, and goji berries. So the nightshades, the peel and the seeds have the lectins. And Native American Indians in the Southwest always peel and de-seed their peppers. They char their peppers, they de-seed them, and then they either grind it into chili or eat them that way. But they always do that. The Italians always peel and de-seed their tomatoes before they make sauce.
And is this like a cultural intuition kind of thing where they...
Yeah. What I like to do is I go around the world studying cultures and figuring out why did they do this? How did they detoxify lectins? For instance, rice was invented 8,000 years ago. 4 billion people use rice as their staple. Yet 4 billion people take the hull off of rice and eat it white. And surely there can't be 4 billion dumb people who don't know any better that white rice is bad for them and brown rice is good for them. In fact, they've been taking the hull off of rice for 8,000 years. Same way, believe it or not, up until William and Harvey Kellogg in the early 1900s did the idea that whole grains were good for us. And if you look back 50 years, and when the whole grain goodness really caught on, you'll notice that a lot of our current health issues, including this epidemic of autoimmune disease, didn't occur. This epidemic of dementia didn't occur. And so whole grains are one of those wonderful myths that got perpetrated by a few individuals. The other individual that perpetrated this, English surgeon by the name of Dr. Burkitt. And Dr. Burkitt did some missionary work in Africa in the middle of the last century. And he is a colon surgeon, a guy who would operate on colon cancers. And he went down there to do some work and nobody had colon cancer. And he actually went around and watched and looked at the bowel movements of these Africans who were eating huge amounts of tubers, things like yams, for instance, or celeriac root or jicama. And their bowel movements were huge. And he goes, wow, look at they're eating all this fibrous stuff. And it must be that the fiber in their diet is keeping them from having colon cancer. So he came back to England and he espoused the fiber theory of preventing cancer. Now the problem is, in England, they didn't have a lot of these sorts of tuberous foods, but they had tons of what's called insoluble fiber in the form of wheat and rye and barley and even oats. So he didn't know the difference between insoluble fiber and soluble fiber. And so he said, we should all be eating fiber. And so that's actually where that whole idea that the hull was actually good for you. Now the ironic thing is he actually died of colon cancer.
That is very ironic.
Very ironic. There's a saying among surgeons that we always die from the disease we treat. So,
well then, there's so many interesting points in there. Talk to me about how animal meats end up, because you don't eat hardly any. How does lectin find its way into animal meat?
We raise animals with antibiotics, and this was discovered by accident years ago when they were thinking that antibiotics might be needed for crowded conditions of stockyard animals. But the researcher found out that by giving antibiotics to these animals, they grew faster and got fatter much quicker than the animals who didn't get the antibiotics. So it was approved by the Department of Agriculture and the FDA to give antibiotics to animals for the purpose of growth. What we didn't know is that those residual antibiotics are incorporated into the meat of the beef, the chicken, the pork, you name it. And so we actually, every time we ingest factory-raised meats or even farm-raised fish, ingest microdoses of antibiotics. Microdoses of antibiotics are incredibly effective at killing off your microbiome.